The locks had been changed while they were sleeping. Claudette Okafor discovered this at 12:14 in the morning when she came downstairs to get water for her youngest and found the deadbolt unresponsive, the chain lock disconnected, and a notice taped to the outside of the door that she could read through the glass panel. A yellow sheet of paper, the kind that looks official because someone has decided that yellow makes things look official, with the words "Notice of Possession" printed across the top in large black letters. She stood in her kitchen in the dark for a moment. She was 41 years old, a home health aide who worked 6 days a week, the mother of 3 children whose ages were 14, 11, and 7, and the primary tenant of a 4-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of 4477 Meridian Street, a building she had lived in for 6 years, paid her rent in full every month, and trusted with the ordinary faith people extend to places that have become home. The building owner's name was Gary Pruitt. He had called her that afternoon to tell her she had 48 hours to vacate. When she explained that she had 6 months remaining on her lease and had not received any prior notice of any lease violation, he told her the building was being converted and that she needed to find somewhere else. When she said she didn't think he could do that unilaterally, he said she could take it up with whoever she wanted. When she said she intended to, he told her, and these were his words, clearly, without ambiguity, that people like her always thought they had more rights than they did. He had changed the locks 12 hours later. What Gary Pruitt did not know, and had not thought to ask, and had not considered relevant even if he had wondered. The woman standing in the kitchen, in the dark, reading a yellow notice through a glass panel at 12:14 in the morning, was not without resources. She was not without resources at all. Go back 7 years. Claudette Okafor had moved to this city from Columbus, Ohio after her divorce, with 3 children under the age of 9, $4,200 in savings, and a professional license in home health care that she intended to use as a bridge while she figured out the next thing. She was not naive about the math of single parenthood. She had grown up watching her own mother navigate it. The careful management of fixed income and variable emergencies, the specific discipline of knowing exactly which bill could wait 3 days and which could not. She found the apartment on Meridian Street through a colleague who was moving out of the building. The rent was manageable. The school district was decent. The landlord, Gary Pruitt, whom she met once at lease signing, had seemed unremarkable in the way that landlords can seem unremarkable when what you mostly need from them is a functioning furnace and a roof that doesn't leak. The apartment was home within a year. Her kids settled. She built a life around the rhythms of the neighborhood, the corner store where the owner knew her children's names, the park 2 blocks over, the church on Halsted where she sang in the choir on Sunday mornings. She renewed her lease twice without incident. She paid her rent on the 1st of every month, always on time, often slightly early, because she had her mother's relationship with financial discipline, and because she did not believe in giving people with power over her a reason to look at her sideways. Gary Pruitt, for his part, had not built his portfolio through patience or principle. He owned 17 properties across the city, apartment buildings, a few commercial spaces, 2 mixed-use buildings he had acquired in a foreclosure wave that had made certain kinds of real estate investors very wealthy at the direct expense of the families who had lost those properties. He had started with 1 inherited duplex in his late 20s and grown from there through a combination of cheap debt, aggressive acquisition, and a philosophy of ownership that his property attorney had once described, in a private moment of candor, as operating right at the edge of what the law allowed. His approach to property management was extractive in the specific way that treats tenants as temporary occupants of an asset rather than people building lives in homes. He raised rents as frequently as the statute permitted. He deferred maintenance until city inspectors or tenant complaints forced action, then repaired at minimum cost with minimum contractors. He screened rental applications with a thoroughness that several people who had dealt with him over the years had noticed ran along demographic lines that were difficult to explain by income or credit score alone, but which no one had yet assembled into a documented pattern. Because the people it affected most were also the people with the least time, money, and institutional knowledge to pursue a complaint through the processes that existed for exactly that purpose. He had been wanting the Meridian Street building's 3rd and 4th floors back for 2 years. A developer had approached him about converting the upper units to short-term rentals, $350 to $450 a night. No leases. No maintenance obligations beyond the cosmetic. No tenants who could inconvenience him with rights. The economics were straightforward. The obstacle was the remaining leases. Claudette's was the last one standing, and it had 6 months left to run. He had decided not to wait. He had done this before. Applied pressure. Moved people out early. Absorbed the small friction of a complaint that never went anywhere because the person filing it didn't have a Sandra Echebe's number in their phone. He expected this to go the same way. This was the miscalculation that would cost him everything. Gary Pruitt had made mistakes like this before, without consequence. Which is precisely the kind of experience that teaches a man the wrong lesson about what the world will allow. The lesson it had taught him was that it would allow anything. He was about to learn what happens when that lesson turns out to be wrong. The pattern of what he had done and had done before became clear in the first 48 hours after the eviction. Claudette did not call a lawyer first. She called her sister Renee, who lived 40 minutes away and whose living room floor her children slept on that first night, while Claudette sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and worked through what she knew and what she needed to find out. What she knew: she had 6 months on her lease. She had never missed a payment. She had received no written notice of any lease violation in 6 years. The locks had been changed without a court order, without any formal eviction proceeding, without the process that the law, even a law that tilts significantly toward property owners, requires before a tenant can be removed from a home they legally occupy. What she needed to find out: whether Gary Pruitt had done this to other people, whether those people were findable, whether the pattern was documentable. She suspected the answer to all three was yes. Here's why. 6 months earlier, a neighbor 2 floors below her, a woman named Dolores Reyes, who had lived in the building for 9 years, had been told her lease wasn't being renewed and moved out within the month, quickly, in a way that Claudette had noticed, but not yet understood. The month before that, a young couple on the 4th floor, the Washingtons, who had 2 kids the same ages as Claudette's middle 2, had left abruptly after a dispute over a maintenance issue that had never been resolved. Claudette had watched both departures from a distance and filed them in the part of her mind that notices patterns without immediately knowing what to do with them. Now, she knew what to do. She called Dolores Reyes the next morning. Dolores described a conversation with Gary Pruitt that was nearly word for word identical to Claudette's. The building was being converted. She needed to leave. No written violation. No court process. And Dolores, whose first language was Spanish and who had not known she had the right to contest, had left. She called Marcus Washington, the husband from the 4th floor couple. He described the same sequence. A maintenance problem Gary had manufactured into a lease violation. Pressure applied quickly. A move out that felt coerced because it was. 3 tenants. 3 departures. 1 landlord. And a pattern that was becoming something a lawyer could use. Claudette's eldest daughter, Imani, 14 years old, deliberate and precise in the way of children raised by deliberate and precise mothers, had spent the night her family slept on her aunt's floor, searching Gary Pruitt's name online. She brought her findings to the kitchen table at 7 in the morning with the composure of a person who has something important to say and wants to say it correctly. Gary Pruitt had been named in a fair housing complaint 3 years earlier. The complaint had been filed by 2 former tenants of a different building he owned. It had not been resolved, dismissed on a technicality related to documentation, but it was on record. Imani had found it in a public database. She had also found the name of the attorney who had filed it. Her name was Sandra Achebe. Claudette called her at 8:30 in the morning. Sandra answered before the second ring was finished. Sandra Achebe had been practicing tenant rights and fair housing law for 14 years, and she recognized what Claudette was describing within the first 3 minutes of the call, the way a diagnostician recognizes a condition they have seen many times before, not with detachment, but with the focused, forward-leaning attention of someone who knows exactly how to proceed and is already proceeding while still listening. She asked for the lease. Claudette had it photographed and saved to her phone's cloud backup. Because Claudette Okafor was the kind of person who kept records, not obsessively, not in anticipation of disaster, but because she had grown up watching her mother lose arguments she should have won, because she couldn't prove what she knew was true, and she had decided early that she would not be in that position. She asked for the payment history. Claudette had every receipt and bank statement going back 6 years, organized by year in a folder on her phone. She asked if Claudette had the call recorded from the afternoon before. Claudette did not. She hadn't known to. But she had the text messages Gary had sent in the 2 weeks prior. Messages that, read in sequence without any charitable interpretation, told the story of escalating pressure applied without legal justification, in language that a fair housing attorney would describe as remarkably self-incriminating. Sandra said, "I need you to come in today." Claudette came in that afternoon with her folder, her phone, the names and numbers of Dolores Reyes and Marcus Washington and Imani, because Imani had found this attorney and had earned the right to be in the room. Sandra spent 2 hours with her. She reviewed the lease. She reviewed the texts. She called Dolores and Marcus herself briefly to establish that their accounts were independent and consistent. When the meeting ended, she called her paralegal and told him to clear Thursday's calendar and start a filing, because here is what Sandra had assembled in 2 hours. From 1 organized client and 2 phone calls, an illegal lockout, a per se violation of tenant rights statutes that does not require proof of discriminatory intent, only proof of the act, combined with a documented pattern across 3 tenancies that, when mapped against the demographics of the displaced tenants, established a fair housing claim with both merit and evidence, real evidence. The documentary kind. The kind that does not require a sympathetic jury to imagine what probably happened, because what happened was written down and time-stamped and sitting in a folder on a phone that had never been wiped. She filed the emergency injunctive relief petition at 4:30 that afternoon. The judge on duty reviewed it the same evening. Gary Pruitt was served at his home at 9:15 the following morning. The emergency order required immediate restoration of access to the apartment at 4417 Meridian Street, Unit 3B. It froze any conversion activity on the building's upper floors, pending the outcome of a fair housing investigation, and it required Gary Pruitt to appear at an emergency hearing the following day to show cause why a preliminary injunction should not be issued. He did not take it seriously at first. He had been served with notices before. He had a property attorney, a man named Dennis Coyle, who handled things like this with the confident briskness of someone who had made a profitable career out of knowing how far landlords could push, and he called Dennis within minutes of the service. Dennis read the filing. Then he called Gary back and told him, with a directness that Dennis reserved for clients who needed things stated plainly, that this was not routine. The fair housing component was the problem. The pattern across 3 tenants, documented, time-stamped, corroborated, was the problem. The illegal lockout, which had left a mother and 3 children displaced from a legal tenancy in the middle of the night, was a problem. And the prior complaint from 3 years earlier, which would be admissible as evidence of pattern and practice, was the largest problem of all. Dennis told Gary that the judge at tomorrow's hearing was going to want to know why he had changed the locks on a family at midnight without a court order, and that whatever answer Gary had prepared, Dennis needed to hear it first. Gary's answer was not good enough. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. Claudette sat at the plaintiff's table with Sandra beside her and her 2 older children in the gallery behind her, Imani still and watchful, her son Marcus 11, and trying to understand the machinery of what was happening on their behalf. The judge asked Gary Pruitt's attorney 3 questions. The 3rd question was about the prior complaint. Dennis Coyle answered it carefully and accurately, and it was still not enough. Because the careful and accurate answer was that the complaint existed and had been filed by 2 tenants, describing a pattern consistent with what was now before the court. The preliminary injunction was granted. Claudette's access to her apartment was restored effective immediately. But Sandra had not come to this hearing only for the injunction. She came for what happened next. In the room where things that look like endings turn into beginnings, it is usually because someone has done the work to make the math change. Sandra filed the full fair housing complaint with the state's civil rights agency the same afternoon the injunction was granted. The complaint named all 3 tenants, documented the pattern across all 3 tenancies, and included a damages calculation that was precise and well supported and considerably larger than Gary Pruitt had anticipated. It also triggered an automatic audit of Gary Pruitt's rental portfolio by the city's housing authority, an audit that Gary's careful avoidance of formal complaints had so far prevented, and that, once begun, moved with the methodical efficiency of a process that has been waiting for permission to start. The audit found 11 code violations across 3 buildings. 2 of those violations were structural issues that should have been reported and repaired years earlier. 4 units in a separate building were found to be operating without current certificates of occupancy, a fact that exposed Gary to municipal penalties and civil liability from current tenants that opened a second front he had not anticipated. His lender, the bank holding the note on 4417 Meridian Street and 2 other properties, reviewed the audit findings as a matter of standard covenant compliance. The covenants had language about regulatory violations. The bank's compliance officer read the fair housing complaint, read the audit, and made a call to Gary's loan officer. The call concerned Gary's portfolio's compliance status. Gary's attorney received a letter from the bank 11 days after the hearing. The letter gave him 30 days to resolve the outstanding violations or face acceleration of his outstanding loans. He could not resolve 11 code violations in 30 days. He could not manage the fair housing liability and the municipal penalties and the tenant lawsuits that were now accumulating across his portfolio simultaneously. He had built his empire on the assumption that individual tenants, people without resources, without records, without the knowledge that the law had teeth, would always be easier to move than to accommodate. He had miscalculated once, on one morning, about one family. And the math had changed. The sale of 4417 Meridian Street was completed 61 days after the midnight eviction. Gary Pruitt sold it as part of a distressed portfolio liquidation negotiated by a bank that had run out of patience and a property owner who had run out of options. The buyer was a community land trust that Sandra Akebe had quietly introduced into the process. an organization that purchased properties and converted them to long-term affordable housing, governed by residents, protected from speculative sale in perpetuity. Claudette Okafor was offered the first unit in the new tenant ownership structure, at a price that reflected the building's adjusted valuation rather than the market speculation that had driven Gary's conversion plans. She accepted on a Thursday morning, sitting at Sandra's conference room table, with Amani on one side and her two younger children in chairs against the wall, eating the sandwiches Sandra's assistant had brought because it was noon and they had been there since 9. Claudette signed the paperwork with the careful attention she brought to everything that mattered. Then she sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not with the frozen expression of someone processing shock, but with the still, composed expression of a woman who had done what needed to be done and was now allowing herself to understand what it had produced. The penthouse unit, the fourth-floor corner apartment that Gary Pruitt had planned to convert to a short-term rental at $400 a night, was the largest unit in the building. 4 bedrooms, corner windows, a small terrace that caught the afternoon light. It was now Claudette's, not rented, not occupied under someone else's terms, owned in the full, protected, unconditional sense of the word by a woman who had moved to this city with $4, $200 and a professional license and 3 children, and the kind of discipline that most people never understand as a form of power until it proves itself in a moment that requires everything. Imani had looked up from the sandwich when the final paper was signed and said, quietly and without drama, "So it's ours now." Claudette looked at her eldest daughter, at the 14-year-old who had spent the night of the eviction searching databases instead of crying, who had found the prior complaint, who had found Sandra Ashebi's name, and said, "It's ours now." Gary Pruitt sold the last of his portfolio properties 8 months later. The fair housing case settled before trial. The settlement terms were confidential, but the Civil Rights Agency's finding of reasonable cause, issued 6 weeks before the settlement, was public record and permanently attached to his name in every database where such things are logged. Sandra Ashebe added the case to the precedent file she kept for new clients who needed to understand what organized documentation and the right law, applied with precision, could accomplish. She did not describe it as unusual. She described it as what the system was capable of when the people using it knew how. Dolores Reyes was rehoused in a comparable unit in the Land Trust's second building, acquired the following year. Marcus Washington and his family found stable housing through a referral Sandra made to a tenant resource organization the week after the hearing. Claudette Okafor sang in the choir at the church on Halsted on the Sunday after she signed the papers. She did not announce anything. She did not make a speech. She stood in the second row where she always stood, sang the hymns she had always sung, and when the service was over, she walked 2 blocks to the park where her youngest liked to feed the ducks, and stood in the afternoon light and let the week settle into something she could carry. The corner store owner, who had known her children's names for 4 years, asked her how she was doing when she came in for milk on the way home. She said, "Well." She meant it the way you mean something when the word has earned its weight.